Welcome back to 7 Questions Jesus Asked. And today's question in week 2 is, what do you want me to do for you? Mark chapter 10, verse 51. Now, this is the story of this blind man, Bartimaeus. It's actually told in Matthew and Mark and Luke. And we call those gospels the synoptic gospels because they all contain a lot of the same material. And I encouraged you last week actually to take the time to study all of these stories that we're looking at in more depth. So some people have gone into this and they've looked at the different accounts and compared the parallel accounts and come away seeing a contradiction. And just so that you're aware of that, I'm going to kind of show it to you right now. Mark and Luke record one blind man, all right? Matthew actually records 2 in his story. And there's also some confusion over whether or not they were coming to Jericho or going away from Jericho. So if you read the accounts, you'll see and you'll say, hey, these don't seem to match up. Now, there was an old Jericho and a new Jericho, all right, just so you're aware. So that is kind of easy to explain in terms of how one was seeing the perspective of where Jesus was going or whether these, where this was taking place. It seems obvious to me, comparing the 2 accounts, that there were 2 blind men, but that one of them was more prominent than the other. That's my take on this, that Bartimaeus was the prominent one. He's the one that gets named. Anyway, we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But the question of the day today is, what do you want me to do for you? Now, sometimes Jesus asks questions that seem to be very obvious. Right? Why is it obvious? Well, he's a blind man. Guess what he wants, right? He was yelling by the side of the road, have mercy on me. What do you think he wants, right? So it seems to be a pretty obvious question. What did he think Jesus was actually going to ask, right? I have this gift card that I know that I spent some money on, but for the life of me, I can't remember how much of a balance I have on it. Jesus, could you help me? Right? Like, that's not the question he was going to ask. It seems a little silly, but we know that Jesus does everything for a reason, so let's try to understand why Jesus is asking this question. And I would say right up front, the fact that the answer seems so obvious suggests that this is a rhetorical question. He's using it not so much to get an answer as he is to provoke thought. And so you have to go into this understanding what Jesus is doing here. So before we can even start, I'm going to offer a proposition that the question that Jesus is asking Bartimaeus here is one that he not only wanted Bartimaeus to answer, but it's one that he wanted all of us to answer. Okay? And Jesus did this a lot in his teaching. He wants us to put ourselves in Bartimaeus' place. And by extension, Jesus is inviting you into a place of humility this morning. All right? He's asking you to identify with a man who is blind, who is a beggar. He's basically the lowest rung of society. He's helpless, he is shameless, and he is in need of mercy. And if you aren't ready to do that this morning, then the truth is there's really not much for you here in this passage. But if you are, then I think you'll go away blessed. So I encourage you to have that perspective. Here's the first thing that I see as we look at this question. I think, number one, Jesus uses this question to help us see if we know what we want. You ever think that Jesus sometimes does that? He asks us these questions to see if we know what we want. He uses this question here to check Bartimaeus' faith, to see if he really knows what he wants. And I think Jesus asks us the same question in many times and places, sometimes in the quietness of our hearts. What do you want me to do for you? Now, Bartimaeus could have answered very differently here, right? Blindness in his day meant a life of poverty, that he was destined to beg for the rest of his life. And so he was never going to have wealth. So he could have asked Jesus, right? Could you make me wealthy? Make me filthy rich, Jesus. He could have asked him that so he could live in luxury. He could have asked him to make him prominent, right? To be famous. He could have asked anything of him. But the blind man knew what the foundational problem was in his life. The foundational problem was that he couldn't see. Blindness was the issue. And so Jesus' question does a great job of putting a finger on the real issue. What is the real issue, Bartimaeus? And the same will happen for each of us as we wrestle with Jesus' question. I want each of you today to ask yourself, what do I want Jesus to do for me? Do you ever stop and ask that question? What do I want from Jesus today? What do I need from Jesus today? What am I asking him for? You may start with a secondary or tertiary issue. We are famous for doing this. In fact, it may well be the reason why your prayers are not being answered, because you're not really getting to the real issue. Let me give you an example. A lot of people will say, well, I want to be financially secure. Jesus, make me financially secure. And then you kind of have to ask the question, why, if you're going to drill down on this? Why? Won't you feel safe unless you are? Because if that's true for you, then there's a deeper issue going on here, a deeper issue related to security. Where do you find your security? Why do you want to be financially secure? Won't you feel worthy? If that's your issue, then there's a deeper issue going on here in relation to where you find your value. And that's the issue that you really need to put your finger on. I want to be financially secure. Why? Well, maybe you just don't want to adjust your lifestyle. Is that the issue? Like maybe you could become wealthy, but you don't have, the proper disciplines in place. And so that's a deeper issue related to discipline. You see what I'm saying here? There's deeper issues on these things. And so I want to give you a challenge this week. Get to the deeper issue and start praying to God for that, right? Just don't assume that the first thing that you come to Jesus asking for is what you really are wanting. Get to the real issue. And Jesus is using this question here to see if we know what we want. But often we don't. We haven't dug deep enough to know what our heart really craves. Many of our desires are connected to legitimate roots, but we don't always connect the dots and follow it all the way down. On a physical level, Bartimaeus couldn't see, but what he could see was his real need. And he gets credit for this. It's his sight. He knew that the real issue was his sight. By the way, some of you might be here today and you're asking Jesus for all kinds of things, but you're still spiritually blind. And Jesus' first desire for you is to open your eyes spiritually. In John chapter 8, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Maybe you're asking for all kinds of things from Jesus, but the first thing is that your eyes be opened to his truth, to his life, to his light, that you be spiritually awake and alive. And so first things first, do you know what you really want? Do you know what you really need? Stop sitting in the fog. I encourage you, go home today, get out a piece of paper and a pen and wrestle through it. What is it that I really want from Jesus? The second thing here is that Jesus uses this question to help us see if we really believe that he can help us. And you can kind of see this in the way he's posing this question. We just saw that Jesus wants to test the focus of our faith. Here we're saying that he also wants to use this question to test the strength of our faith, to help us see if we really believe that he can help. Guys, here's a simple fact. We don't accept help from people if we really don't think that they're able to help. We don't. This is how we're wired. Your car is acting up, and so you go to the garage, and as you go into the garage to see your mechanic, there's a 7-year-old little boy that comes up to you, right? And he says, what do you want me to do for you? I want you to get out of the way so I can talk to the mechanic, right? You go to the dentist, and the receptionist says, I see that you called about an aching tooth. Do you want me to take a look at that for you? No, I'd like to talk to the dentist, actually, about this, right? The simple act of Jesus asking, what do you want me to do for you, forces us to acknowledge whether or not we actually believe that he can do anything for us in the first place. And I've seen this with unbelieving people before. You know, I've had this happen many times where they have a problem, an issue in their life, right? I'm a pastor, so they open up about these things and they share this issue that they're having with me. And I say, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to pray for you about that. And then they say, yeah, whatever, right? I've had that happen so many times. Whatever. There's no faith there. You can just see there's no faith. They're like, you can do that little exercise in futility if you want, but even Christians can get to this point where they doubt that Jesus will do anything for them. And so they never clearly identify that thing that they want from God and ask him clearly for it. I want you to imagine if Jesus is standing right in front of you, right? And he's asking you, what do you want me to do for you? You need to come up with something, right? He's there in front of you asking you, what do you want me to do for you? And so kudos to this blind beggar, because when his moment came, he was ready. Have you seen the cues in this passage that indicate that he was ready? First of all, he was in the right place. He somehow must have heard that Jesus was going to be going along this road, and so he was positioned there. Secondly, he was listening for when Jesus came by, right? And when you lose your sense of sight, apparently your other senses become stronger. He heard everything that was happening as Jesus was coming. Thirdly, he called out shamelessly, Jesus, Jesus, right? Son of David, I'm over here, right? Fourthly, he didn't listen to the people who told him to shut up, and there were a lot of them. Be quiet. You're annoying him. He didn't care. And then finally, this is a good one. He knew who Jesus really was. He said, Son of David, right? He knew that Jesus was the Messiah. This is very interesting. Guys, the Bible teaches that Jesus is only ever a prayer away for any one of us. Do you believe that Jesus can help you? Bartimaeus did. And he wasn't going to be turned away. In Hebrews chapter 11, it says, without faith, it's impossible to please God, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. And so Jesus' question, what do you want me to do for you? It helps us to see if we really do believe, if we really do have faith. Thirdly, Jesus uses this question to give us an opportunity to express our trust in him. It's one thing if you believe internally, but now he's also giving us an opportunity to express our trust. The first step is to see if we really believe, but then he gives us the chance to say it. And Bartimaeus here, he verbalizes his faith. And when Jesus asks him this question, what do you want me to do for you? He says, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. Verbalization, guys, it's very, very important to God. It's very important. And a lot of Christians overlook this. They focus so much on the internal that they don't get to the point of these things becoming external. The Bible teaches that everything becomes real with words. You should do a study on this sometime. The power of words as it relates to God, as it relates to what he's doing in the world. Unless something is spoken, it's only an idea. Think about this. God thought about creating the universe, and then one day he spoke. God said, and it was so. And if you read Genesis chapter 1, 8 times, God spoke, and it was so. He spoke, and it came into being. He had a better plan for mankind, and so he spoke the law to Moses, who wrote it down. He spoke, and he gave them the law. Later on, he spoke his word through the prophets. He created the world through Jesus Christ, who is called the Word. He actually spoke through him. Think about this, guys. A thought is a baby in the dark womb. A word is a baby that is born into the light. And yes, that is my new grandson, Levi and Maggie. So this is Levi Douglas Layton, who was born this week. Yes, it's very exciting. So these pictures were used with permission. But guys, think about it. A thought that never gets spoken. It's kind of like a stillborn baby, which is a very terrible concept. But this is a thought that never gets spoken. And this is why it's so important to God that we verbalize what it is that we want. You know, some of you have been coming to church for years, and, you know, you hang around and you hear the word of God, which is great. Don't stop doing that. We love the fact that you do. Internally, you agree with a lot of it, but the truth is some of you, you've still never verbalized your faith. It's a thought, but you've never verbalized it. It's never become that reality. It's so important. Romans chapter 10, verses 9 and 10, the Apostle Paul says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You see the two components? Your mouth and your heart. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. According to Paul, the heart and the mouth have to act in harmony for salvation to happen. There's something that happens internally, and then there is a public confession, profession of this faith. There's a verbalization to it. And so I can't say enough about the importance of verbalization, and we could also use the word declaration, right? There's this idea that you declare what it is that you believe to be true. We really do understand that this concept is important in our society. You can look around and see how many, ways and places where we require for people to declare something in order for reality to have taken place. But sometimes we try to pretend that this isn't real. But listen, you know that this is real. When you cross the border, you have to declare what you are bringing with you, right? We know these things. You go to the court for a traffic ticket, right? A traffic ticket. Some of us go more often than others. And you need to declare if you are guilty or not before the judge. When you get married, the pastor asks you, do you so-and-so take so-and-so, right? You need to declare your vows. We understand that declaration is what makes reality in our world. Up until then, it's just a thought. But he's looking for this declaration. For the same reason, when we come to Jesus in faith, we are called to be baptized. This is what baptism is for. And God knew that words are difficult for many of us, and so he even lets us use a symbol. But we must declare it. We have to declare it. He's calling on us to do that. In Matthew chapter 10, it says, so everyone who acknowledges me before men, Jesus says, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. Do you see how important that verbalization is, that declaration is? Guys, we live in a day when people are hesitant to declare their thoughts, and especially their commitments publicly. Nobody wants to declare those things publicly. They don't want to be on the hook, right, for, saying these things and putting that stuff out there. But Jesus wasn't going to skip over this important step with Bartimaeus. And so he asks him publicly in front of everybody, what do you want me to do for you? Answer, right? And Jesus heals him and he says, go your way. What does he say? Your faith has made you whole. Now, in Bartimaeus' case, he appears to be made whole both physically and spiritually here in the story when he tells him that his faith has made him whole. Now, we already saw he believed who Jesus was, that he was the Messiah. We can see that in his confession of him being the Son of David. But the verbalization of his faith in Jesus' ability to heal also showed the condition of his heart. Let me ask you guys, do you have the faith to verbalize your prayer requests? So many of our prayer requests, they're just like in the fog, in our mind somewhere. It's a fleeting thought. We don't write it down. We don't tell anybody about it. And so we allow it to kind of just be there in the fog and dissipate easily. Do you ever let others know what it is that you're praying about so that they can come back and say, hey, did that actually happen? Are you continuing to persist in prayer for that thing that was so important to you? Guys, I'm encouraging you, do it. Do it. Make these things public. Get it out there. Let people know what it is that you want from God and what you're praying for. And they will pray along with you. Jesus wants us to declare our faith in him. Guys, this simple question that Jesus asked, it's accomplishing so much. Can you see what the power of a rhetorical question can do? Well, the fourth thing here I'd mention is that Jesus is using this question to give clarity to those who are watching as well. Sometimes, guys, we get so focused on the specific miracle that Jesus is doing that we forget that there are crowds of people around that are listening and that are watching, that are taking in this entire scene. Whenever Jesus is interacting with an individual that you see in these different stories, he's teaching other people at the same time. All these people that are watching, they're getting a lesson. And we are 2,000 years, right, from the time of the story. We're getting a lesson from it too, as we observe through the story. As he addresses Bartimaeus' physical blindness, he is also addressing the concept of spiritual blindness as well. In fact, when you read the Gospels, spiritual blindness is one of the most prominent lessons that Jesus addressed in his teaching. If you look at John chapter 9, he heals a man who was born blind, and he uses that to expose the blindness of the Pharisees who were witnessing what was taking place. After he heals the blind man, Jesus meets again with him just a little bit later on, and look at what he says. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see," and he meant by that those who are spiritually blind and admit it, that those people may see, and that those who see, and by that he meant those who are spiritually blind but won't admit it, may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" You can almost hear the arrogance in their voice. Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt." In other words, if you admitted it. But now that you say, "We see," your guilt remains. You're living in denial. And so your guilt remains. And so Jesus is always teaching a deeper lesson. And I said at the outset today that catching Jesus' lesson, it requires humility for the people that are observing. That's true for us today as well. We have to approach this like Bartimaeus. We have to admit that we're sinners, that we're spiritually blind like Bartimaeus is physically blind. We have to acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah that God promised to us. We have to believe that he can make us whole. We have to confess publicly our need of his healing and accept it. Guys, on a personal level, I've often confessed to you that I'm really glad that Jesus got a hold of me when I was just a little child. I wasn't even 5 years old when I first kind of confessed with my mouth who I believed Jesus to be. And I say this, and I still hold to this today because I really think, knowing my own heart and my own pride, that if God would have waited longer, right, to connect with me in that way, I don't know if I would have made that decision. Because children, they don't have all that pride holding them back. They don't have all of those things, that self-sufficiency. I'm really grateful to God that he got a hold of me when I was a kid and my heart was soft. People need to come to Jesus like little children, needy and dependent. It's easier when you actually are a child. But as an adult, sometimes that can be very difficult. And as people watch Jesus interacting here with Bartimaeus, I think they start to understand this. They're starting to feel the dynamics, the spiritual dynamics at play. This is requiring humility. Jesus' simple question is bringing clarity to all of these issues. Well, Bartimaeus, he really is a model of faith, and his story stands as one of these stories that challenges our faith. I started today by mentioning that Matthew's gospel actually records 2 blind men. Now, like I said, it seems obvious to me that there were 2, but that one was more prominent, which is why Mark focuses in on him. That's Bartimaeus. But my take on the whole thing, here's what I think is actually happening, what actually historically happened. I think that there were 2 beggars, 2 blind men. I think the second one, I think he just rode on Bartimaeus' coattails. That's what I think happened. I can picture Bartimaeus as this bold, courageous one. He's full of faith. He doesn't have a problem verbalizing, right? And I can also picture this other blind man as desperately wanting healing as well, but being this shy one who just kind of sits back in Bartimaeus' shadow. There's no record of him shouting out. We don't even know his name. We know that he got physical healing, but we don't know if he got spiritual healing like Bartimaeus did. Maybe some of us relate more to that nameless blind man. And I would say this, guys, note, sometimes you do need to piggyback on someone else's faith. Let's not deny anything. When I'm making a decision to follow Jesus when I'm 4, maybe 5 years old, you think I'm not riding on my parents' faith? Obviously, I am. You don't think at different times in your life, even now, at whatever age you are, you don't think there are times that you're riding on somebody else's faith? Of course you are. We all do this sometimes. And that's why you need to stay close to other people of faith. It's kind of like that story of the paralytic who was carried to Jesus by his 4 friends. Do you remember the story? They carried him on his cot, and there was such a crowd, they couldn't get in through the door of the house. They literally went up on the roof, and they opened the roof, and they lowered him down. Do you know what the passage says? It says, when Jesus saw their faith, that they healed him. Right? He was riding on the faith of his friends. He had really good friends. But at some point, guys, you're going to have to confess with your own mouth. You're going to have to stand on your own faith. In Romans chapter 14, verse 12, it says, each of us will give an account of himself to God. someday, somewhere, you're going to have to give your own account to God and where you're at with your own faith. Well, this man was blessed to have been with Bartimaeus, but here's a fact that gets highlighted from this whole story, and that is this: when you act in faith, guys, the faith of others is always strengthened. It always is. And you have the chance to impact so many people with your faith. I bet you overlook this every day, how much ability you have to be someone who changes the course of history for another individual by holding them close with your faith, by letting them ride on your coattails for a little bit. In your faith. Probably the greatest privilege I've had in my life is to encourage other people in their faith. I think back when I was just leading the young people in my church as one of the older young people. And I look at that today, and there's so many of them that are following Jesus today, many of them that are in full-time ministry today. And to know that my faith had a little part in pulling them in that direction. My friends in high school, I had a couple that were believers, I had some that weren't, and some that were kind of on the fence. All of those close friends, they're all following Jesus today. And we get together and we talk, we text each other almost on a daily basis. The people in our church over the years, it's been a privilege. I am very humbled by the gesture today. But it's a privilege. If my faith can encourage your faith, that's all I want. That's what I really want. People in our community, the sports teams that I've been able to coach in, my family. Guys, if you can just be someone whose faith gets transmitted to your own family, if they can see your faith and they follow in faith because of you, what a legacy, right? Guys, we've been conditioned to think, and I remember when I first started in ministry particularly, we get our eyes on these big things that are really at the root. We've talked about this today. At the root, it's about pride. Having a big church and a big ministry, and you get focused on these things. As I've gotten older and wiser, I really see that the best you can really do is just be a good model of faith, which is funny because that's what Paul talked about, right? Just be a good example of faith to the people that God puts in your life. And to be very honest, there have been many times that my faith has been weak. But I've had many good role models of faith and persistence. We all look to Jesus and we all look to Paul, but you know who I think of more? I think of the pastor that was in my church growing up. I think of the elders at the church in Sarah's church where I started working. I think of just faithful people that led the youth group, that were involved in ministry, that served other people, that just showed up. Guys, do you want to give me a gift every week? Just be here. Just be at stuff that we do and encourage people. And let your faith impact other people. That's what gets me excited, right? As I get older as a pastor, the thoughts that go through my head are 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now. Well, what's Renew Church going to look like? I don't know how much longer God's going to enable me to do what I'm doing. I'm not going anywhere, by the way. But none of us know, right? We don't know how long we have, how long our health will permit us to do what we do. We don't know these things. And I ask, who are the people? Like if I was not in the picture, what would Renew Church look like? Who would be the people that would carry this? I really believe the best that you can do is just to be a model of faith for other people. Be faithful. The band's going to come. We're going to wrap this up. And I want to just wrap this up, guys, by asking you straight up, how is your faith today? How is your faith? Is it strong? Is it shaky? Maybe your faith's at the lowest point that it's ever been. I don't know. That will help you know what you should be asking Jesus for. I fear sometimes that some of us have just given up on asking God for things. And I have to admit, sometimes I can be a little fatalistic when it comes to prayer. I can just kind of say to myself, well, God's going to do what he's going to do. Why do I need to pray? Anyone else like that? Am I the only one? Come on, help me out, people, right? Yeah. I think a lot of us are like that. Then again, when we do persist, sometimes we fall into the routine of just praying rote prayers for something, right? We're like, I'm going to be faithful, so I keep praying. So we pray that same rote prayer 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And it can be so long sometimes waiting for a response that you actually forget what you wanted in the first place. Some of us have forgotten that Jesus really does hear. We've forgotten that he really is able. What do you want Jesus to do for you? Jesus taught you have not because you ask not. And he taught us very clearly to be persistent in our prayers. One of the greatest passages is in Luke chapter 18. Let me read it for you. One day Jesus told his disciples a story to show that they should always pray and never give up. There was a judge in a certain city, he said, who neither feared God nor cared about people. A widow of that city came to him repeatedly saying, give me justice in this dispute with my enemy. The judge ignored her for a while, but finally he said to himself, I don't fear God or care about people. He was honest, right? But this woman is driving me crazy. I'm going to see that she gets justice because she's wearing me out with her constant requests. Then the Lord said, learn a lesson from this unjust judge. Even he rendered a just decision in the end. So don't you think God will surely give justice to his chosen people who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will grant justice to them quickly. But when the Son of Man returns, how many will he find on the earth who have faith? That's the great question. One of the signs, according to this passage, that we're getting closer to Christ's return is the faithlessness of his children. That's what he's saying. Is he going to find any faith when he comes back? Anyone that's hanging in there, still depending on God, still being faithful, right? Being consistent, following through with their commitments. Jesus' point here is that even an unjust judge can be worn down by persistence, but our God is not an unjust judge. He's a loving Father. How much more should we ask with anticipation? Guys, I hope that we will be people who persevere in our faith. I'm going to ask you to stand. I want us to read a verse as we close together, and then you can just remain standing for the closing song. Jesus asked this great question in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, verse 11. Let's all read it together, good and loud. If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you for this congregation. They're my family. I love them. I want the best for them. And I know that the best that you have for them, it's all to be found in Christ. It's all to be found in his body, in his church. Lord, encourage each person here today, wherever they're at in their faith. May each of us go home and be honest and ask, what is it that I want from God? Help us to ask the question, help us to drill down on it and see what it really is that we're wanting. And when we see it clearly, and when the Spirit confirms in our heart, this is a true, good spiritual desire that I have, Lord, may we pray with persistence. May we continue to ask you until we get it. Lord, help us to be people of faith. Help us to be people that others can look to and see something of Jesus, something of his kindness and love and persistence. Help each one of us, Lord. Our faith is weak. but we lean on you. In Jesus' name we pray.
Join us every Sunday at 10 a.m. at Cineplex Cinemas in Milton. Or visit us online at renewchurch.ca/connect.